All right, everybody. Welcome. We're gonna have a very weird evening together. Okay, you ready for that? That was a weird song by the Ohio Players called "The Funky Worm." And tonight we're gonna be talking about worms. We are gonna be talking about worms. How does this fit into our larger conversation about ethics that we started a couple of weeks ago, and that we engage in every year during this time between Passover and Shavuot? It's time of preparing to receive the Torah. One of the ways that we prepare is we really try to focus ourselves on ethical study, ethical training, and we've looked at some interesting topics so far. The ethics, I think, probably most straightforward understanding of what that might entail would be a set of instructions, advice for you on how to live righteously, how to live well with other human beings, the do's and the don'ts, the rights and the wrongs, right? And there is a lot of that in Pirkei Avot, which we've been studying, this volume of rabbinic teachings that are non-legal, but do seem to be advising. So it's not like you have to keep kosher, but it's like you really ought to be a good person. It's like in that realm of instruction, and so we've looked at various forms of advice, but the study of ethics, at least through this volume, Pirkei Avot, also includes not exactly instruction, but inspiration. That is, it also addresses the question: how do I motivate myself to be a better person, to change, to develop, to grow? How do I discipline myself? How do I get myself in the right frame of mind? Right? It's, it's not just that I don't know what to do. There are other things inside of me, other urges and motivations and ideas and self images that I contend with, that keep me from even being able to commit to some ethical standard that I might agree is a good one. Right? So all over Pirkei Avot, we will find instruction, but we will also find motivation, inspiration, and a lot of what we'll find in that category is images that are given to us to inspire us, or maybe to scare us a little bit, and that's the image we're going to start with today, an image that is meant to give us a little bit of a chill right from the start. And this Mishnah, as I was looking through the chapter this week, we're on the 4th chapter of Pirkei Avot. In this, there are 6 chapters and 7 weeks between Passover and Shavuot. So we managed to study all 6 chapters during those 7 weeks at some point. So we're in the 4th chapter, and it's this Mishnah that caught my eye. And as soon as it did, I couldn't stop thinking about worms. And the Mishnah is this. I'll just show it to you first. The Mishnah is this. This is our starting point. Rabbi Levitas, which is interesting. That's it's kind of a Greek name, or at least a Greek form of a Jewish name. Rabbi Levi, you would have expected, or Levi. And somewhere in the Talmud it says that he was on the Sanhedrin. There was another Levi, so he changed his name to Levitas. That's an interesting explanation. But anyway, not a very well-known thinker, but he is recorded in Pirkei Avot. He was a man of Yavne, which was the great gathering place outside of Jerusalem, where the rabbis kind of rebuilt their philosophy, their civilization, their schools. And here's what he said: Me'od heve shafel ruach. Be very, very, and this is the language in the Hebrew, me'od, very, 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 very humble of spirit, or lowly of spirit, even literally. Be very, very humble of spirit. Shetikvat enosh rima. For the hope of the human is worms. The hope of the human is worms. Okay, so that's what we're going to be studying tonight is the worm. And why the worm? Because as soon as I read, we'll say a blessing, and then we'll look at this first teaching a little deeper. But as soon as I read it, I thought, my gosh, there's the worm again. The worm comes up all over the place in Jewish ethical literature. And that's what I want to explore with you tonight. Why the worm, of all things, of all creatures, provides a kind of an inspiration in all kinds of different ways, some unsettling and some maybe inspiring. We're going to look at the way the worm is used again and again in rabbinic literature to try and get us in the right frame of mind. Of all things, the worm. Okay, so let's say a blessing, and then we'll start studying the worm, and hopefully by the end we'll have some sort of worm ethics worked out. Okay, so a blessing over our Torah study tonight. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. All right, let's just start with this. I'm going to give you a source sheet, but before I do, let's just meditate a little bit on this first teaching and let's just understand it. So Rabbi Levitas, a man of Yavne, said, be exceedingly humble of spirit, be very humble, be very lowly of spirit, for the hope of the human is worms. It's a very strange phrasing. Now, what does it mean? What does it mean? This is the kind of, if we were in person, I'd have someone answer this, but in Zoom, it's not worth it for me to take your time, but think for a second. What does it mean? What it means is, I almost translate it as the best a human can hope for is to end up as worm food. Right? That's what it means. The hope of, meaning what we can hope for, what we can expect, the best we can expect is to end up in the ground being eaten by worms. Okay, that's, I think, the pshat. That's what I think it means. All the basic commentators say, yeah, one day you go back into the ground and the worms eat you up. Okay, now I want to do a couple of things. I want to first just clarify what we're talking about here. And for that, I'm going to call him my stepfather, Larry, who is an entomologist. He's the bug man in the family and has all kinds of biological knowledge. This is not technically bugs, but I did call Larry up today and ask him, wait. What exactly are we talking? Are we talking about worms here? Because the words in Hebrew that do come up again and again in Hebrew literature are tolat and rima. Tolat and rima. We just saw the word rima there. And they are alternately both translated as worm. But when they're together, the usual translation that you'll see is worms and maggots. Worms and maggots. Worms and maggots. Tolat rima, worms and maggots. We'll see that phrase come up later. So I called my stepfather and I said, wait, what exactly is a maggot and what is a worm? So Larry, will you do us the favor of kind of clarifying, if the rabbis are thinking of worms and maggots, what are they talking about?
Hi. Well, worms is a very general term. In just most people, when they talk about worms, that could refer to all kinds of things. Actually, it's not a scientific or technical term at all, although in the past it referred to very, very general, any non-arthropod invertebrate, which includes all kinds of things. So that's a very loose word that has no really specific scientific meaning. There are specific kinds of worms which do have meanings. Earthworms is probably most familiar with. And there's other kinds of worms, roundworms, flatworms, penis worms, and acorn worms, and ribbon worms, which are all very, very different kinds of things, even though they're all long and don't have legs. But they're very, very different biologically. But what I think they're referring to here really are maggots. Worms mostly, as I said, can feed on many different things, but maggots is the larvae of flies. And certain kinds of flies will lay their eggs in animals that have just recently died. And then the eggs will hatch out, become what's called maggots, and then the maggots will eat the dead animal. And so I assume that sounds like what we're referring to here are actually fly maggots.
Got it. Got it. So like fly larvae, is that right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. And they look kind of like worms, right?
Yeah.
I actually remember when my mom first started dating Larry, and I was a very young boy, and Larry was working with fly larvae, and my mom brought us to like his, and I remember him sifting his hands through a bunch of fly larvae. It was like, whoa, who is this guy? But that years later, and like I'm teaching a Torah class, and that knowledge comes in very handy. So thank you for that, Larry. Okay, so we're talking about maggots. We're talking about what we're really talking about in this case, and the rabbis also somewhat unscientifically are just sort of the worms, describing a lot of things as worms. But what we're talking about is the body decomposing in the ground and being eaten by maggots, right? So now the real question, the ethical question, why is that important to think about? You should be, and this makes you very humble. This will make you very, very humble if you think about this. So you should think about this. You should think about how you're going to be decomposed and eaten by maggots. Like, who wants to think about that? Who wants to think about that? So why are we being encouraged to think about the maggots feeding on our bodies here in this volume of ethical teachings? So I see Florine has a thought.
In the cross-cultural encyclopedia of symbols, worms represent death and disillusion. But what Larry just said is very fascinating to me, because if the maggot is the larvae for flies, then there's an element of resurrection. There's an element of transformation. I think there's also symbolic meaning of something else like the soul. I think the word in itself is the key here, I think.
Great. That is really interesting. Florine's already taking us to really interesting places, because it seems on the sort of the most simple level that what we're being asked to meditate on is our own death, our own demise, our own decay and decomposition. And that's true. But Florine is saying, well, wait a minute. If the worms are eating us, if the maggots are feasting on us, they are doing so, as Larry just explained, because this is their cycle of life, and they're just coming into life. So we become part of the flow of life again. And it's important for us to remember not just that we will die, and not just that we'll die in a gross way, but actually that we become food. We become food. And that's something about that is important, because it suggests that that we actually have a function beyond ourselves. Okay, all right, don't want to add too much to it, but all right, now we're getting into it. Yeah, Elle, what do you think?
Well, when I read something like this, and also that we began with a putrid drop, that in case we ever had a tendency to self-aggrandizement, or if our ego becomes inflated, just remember what you really are. That your body is not your body. This is your end. This is your gorah. So get rid of haughtiness. Stay down to earth.
Okay, great. Okay, and that takes us back to a very straightforward reading of, like, why are we being told to be humble? Should this thought bring us to humility? Because we should come to realize that, we're nothing but worm food. Nothing that we do matters that much. In the end, we'll just be decomposing. Okay, so settle down. You're just you're like everything else that's gross. You're dirt. You look at the gross dirt, but you are that. You are that. And remember that, lest you think you are such a grand and noble creature. Now, as I say that, some of you are thinking, and we will have occasion to think throughout this hour about just how Jewish a sentiment that is. I mean, aren't we supposed to think of ourselves as these grand creatures with infinite potential and a divine image, right? So this is another way to go. This is another kind of message, which is to bring yourself down and remember that you're just muck in the end. You're just worm food, right? Okay. Hyro.
We're biodegradable.
Hmm.
That's really it. And then this reminds us that we're like anything else in nature.
Okay, good. So that's like, I hear the L voice, which is just remember that you come to just nothing. And then I hear the Florine and the Hyro voice, which says, you are a part of the everything. And that also should bring you a sense of perspective and humility, but it isn't actually so depressing. It's just that you should realize you just, and to the ground you shall return, and then, that will regenerate, and you're just part of the swirling circle of life, right? And that's okay too. Elizabeth.
So what it means to me is really that this is the great equalizer among humans. Not only are we just another animal, but it doesn't matter if you were the sagest rabbi and the, really admired person or the king or whatever. At the end of the day, everybody, the slave, the servant, everybody ends up exactly the same. So it's the most amazing equalizer. We are all going to return to dust.
Okay, great. I want to, that's that framing that Elizabeth's just given us, which is that this kind of teaching is a response to your potential for thinking that you are especially important, and maybe especially if you are a person of importance, if you walk about society with some fancy title or status or accomplishment, then also the more so you begin to think, wow, I'm really special. I'm a human, and that's special among all creatures. And then I'm a special human, right? So maybe this is an important equalizing message that, that doesn't let anyone's ego get too out of control. And indeed, all of these worm teachings that we're going to look at seem to revolve around the concern about ego, right? All of these worm teachings are there, or most of them are there, to encourage humility. Okay, so let's take a look at a couple of others. We're not going to we're going to look at them all in depth, but there's one at least that we really have to. One of my favorite worm teaching that we really do have to look at. But here is a classic. Let me give you a classic first. This is from, and we'll look at from 3 different eras, worm teachings from 3 different eras. This is the same era that we've been looking at, the rabbinic period. So this is in the Midrash, which is the same rabbis who wrote the Mishnah, which we're studying, also wrote commentary on the Torah. And in one place, they're talking about the order of creation, where human beings seem to be created last. So why were human beings created last if they were the very pinnacle? And so some of the rabbis say, well, human beings were intended all along. And actually, there are even 2 different creation stories in the beginning of the Torah. So one of them has the humans created last. The other seems to focus most attention on the humans. So one of the famous worm teachings comes from Vayikra Rabbah and says, if a person merits it, im zacha adam, if a person is worthy of it, then we say to them, you were created before all of creation. You were the apple of God's eye. You were the first thing that God thought to create. And if not, we say to them, the mosquito and the worm preceded you. V'im lav amrim lo yatush kadmach shilshul kadmach. Okay, shilshul. This is another word for worm. And in modern Hebrew, shilshul means diarrhea. And I think that's because this word for worm is related to just excrement. So it's like earthworm is basically what they're saying there. Like, worm that feeds on manure, the mosquito that feeds on blood, and the worm that feeds on manure, they came before you. Don't forget that. There were 7 days of creation, and God is sitting there, putting the worm together before God ever thought about you. Okay? So if you start to get too haughty, just remember the worm came first. The worm came first. Okay, so there's another example of good old worm Torah, right? But here, the next piece is the one that I love the most, and that I think actually has, so far we've been trying to take ourselves down a peg. So far we've been trying to remember that we aren't all that great, and that the worm's even better than you. The worm's where you're headed. You're no better than a worm, okay? But the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement in the 1700s, also uses the worm image, but has, I think, a kind of a different spin on the way the worm functions in your consciousness. So let's take a look at what he says. He is also concerned with humility, with not thinking too much of yourself. But I think there's a different approach. If so far we've had a pretty straightforward, like, hey, don't get carried away, don't think you're so great, you're a worm, and to worms you will end up being food. You're just so much crap, basically. Okay, the Baal Shem Tov's teaching is a little different. So let's take a look at what he has to say, and then we'll chew this up for a while, like a worm. This is the Baal Shem Tov's simplest book, collected book of his most basic teachings. Okay, do not think that you are better than your friend. Okay, so he's first of all just talking about how we look at other human beings. Do not think that you are better than your friend because you serve God with true attachment. Okay, so it's not just don't think you're better than other people, but warning you spiritualists, you who are following me and my teachings and praying all day long and trying to ascend to God. That's all very good and well, but don't think that as a result of all your spiritual work that you're better than anyone else. Okay, that's good to hear. For you, like all other creatures, were created for the purpose of serving the Blessed One. The blessed God gave your friend a mind, just as you were given a mind. Okay? It's not so clear yet where he's going, but don't think you're better than anyone else. God made everyone to serve. And you have your consciousness, your friend has their consciousness. Okay. So far, it's a simple teaching on not getting haughty. Okay, but enter the worm. And what makes you any better than a worm? And I love this. Just listen to this. For the worm serves the Creator with all its mind and all its power. Shahatolat oved lahabore yitbarach. The worm serves the blessed Creator. B'chol sichlo v'kocho. The worm serves God with all of its mind and all of its power. And a person, after all, is just another worm and maggot. As it says in Psalms, and here's an even earlier worm image. I am a worm, says King David, and not a man. I'm a lowly worm. I'm such a worm. Okay. And if the blessed God had not given you intelligence, you would not be able to serve any better than a worm. So you are not better than even a worm, let alone another person. Okay, so let's stop there for a sec. Okay, this is different. This is not just like you're lowly and disgusting, just like a worm. You'll end up in the worm's mouth, you gross little thing, you're lowly little worm. No. The worm here is serving God with all of its might and all of its consciousness. Okay, this is a little bit. The worm's doing great. The worm is a servant of God, right? So now we're not lower than the worm, but we are equal to the worm. We're no better than we are a worm. Now, why is that important? Why is it important to remember that the worm serves God with all of its might? Okay. All right. Let's return to our interpreters. Alexandra.
I was thinking about how a worm, how it takes what's trash and takes what is unwanted and waste, or what we might consider waste, and turns it into that which nourishes, and like digs through the muck and changes it into what feeds and what adds light to the world. And so like if we could model ourselves after the worm and do what the worm does, metaphorically, physically, in every way, like we'd be pretty well set, I think.
Beautiful, beautiful. I think that's a very, very insightful interpretation. That the worm is not just doing its best, but actually the worm has a function. Larry explained the function. The maggot has a function, right? The maggot otherwise the flesh would just sit there and rot, but the maggot uses it to regenerate, right? The earthworm is processing food and turning it into soil. I'm not like starting to worry. I'll get a little loose on my science here, and like my stepfather's no. But Alexander's interpretation is I think true to the Baal Shem Tov, which is that all things are doing the best they can, and the animals all the more so. They're doing absolutely. In fact, the problem is you may not be doing the best that you can. Right? The problem is actually with us. You think you're so great and lofty. Are you serving God with all of your might and all of your power? Because the worm contends the Baal Shem Tov. The worm is. Okay. Leah, what do you think of this?
Okay, I have two things. I wrote a little bit in the chat. Every single piece of soil on this planet has gone through the digestive system of an earthworm, providing us with all the food we eat. Everything. That's Darwin. Take a look. And the other thing is that where do we come from? The four corners of the earth, dust was taken. And then from the four corners of the earth, water was taken. I think we replicate that. We relive that every Friday when we're kneading the dough for challah. So we're given hints along the way really early that we're no big deal. We're just a bunch of dust that was kneaded together with water. That was Adam, created, my understanding is, on the eve of Shabbat.
Good. So we're all just creatures. We're all just creatures here on this earth. Oh, I haven't given the source sheet, have I? I see that now in the chat. Sorry. Here's the source sheet. We're all just creatures here on this earth. And we are supposed to remember that there's something lowering about it, like lowly of spirit. You're just like everything else. You're no better than anything else. But the Baal Shem Tov is adding, and you're no worse than anything else. Everything is doing its thing, right? That's like an old Gerard Manley Hopkins poem. Everything does one thing, right? Everything does its thing. And everything is just, matter being reconstituted into new forms of matter and energy. And it's just, you're part of everything. You're part of everything. And that's not a bad thing. That doesn't make you nothing. It just means you're not everything, right? You're part of everything. Okay, so on that note, I want to bring us to the end of the Baal Shem Tov here, because the implications, he says, if you begin to realize that the worm is serving God with all of its might and all of its power, the implication is, where does that take you? What will that make you feel? He says, so you should imagine that you are a worm or one of the other little creatures. Think of them all as your friends in this world. All the bugs, all the worms, all the maggots, right? Think of them all as your friends in this world, all of whom were created and have only what the blessed Creator gave them. Now, again, only what the blessed Creator gave them. You might be smarter than someone else, but that's not something you did. The blessed Creator gave you more intelligence. Now, what are you doing with it? You might be stronger than something else, but that's not your doing. The blessed Creator gave you that strength. So what are you doing with it? Because the worm is working very hard, right? The mosquito is working very hard. every one of them working very hard to do their thing. Are you working very hard to maximize your potential? And the Baal Shem Tov ends, this idea should always be in your thoughts, always be in your thoughts. Okay, so there's some worm Torah for you. There's some worm Torah for you, that you are now no better than the worm. You actually might be trying to catch up to the worm, but because of that, you remember that the worm is your friend. The worm is just one of, we're all in this together. We're all in this together. And so we're here with the worms, we're here with the bugs, we're here with the beetles, we're here with the cats and dogs and horses and cows, and we're all just trying to do our thing, right? So this creates, this worm consciousness creates a sense of interconnectedness, a sense that we're all kind of united, okay? And the worm is once again, the image that the Baal Shem Tov wants us reflecting on to bring us to this place of interconnectedness. Okay, so let's turn back to see what folks think of this. Payam.
I think what the Baal Shem Tov understands about ethics is ethics has to be a choice, that there has to be majesty involved in it, that to be ethical means I can do X, but I can also do Y. And so what he's saying is that, yeah, you can do whatever, that the worm itself is majestic and that the worm, has a purpose. So your choice is, you can do whatever you want, but you can also be a worm, and being a worm isn't bad. Like the previous examples of you're just a worm is Protestant ethics. That doesn't create an ethical system, because if you're nothing, then you can do whatever you want. There's no consequences to your action.
Good. So I think what Payam's remembering the texts we've already looked at and remembering how those earlier texts were perhaps demoralizing. There's something like intentionally demoralizing, like, hey, you, don't think you're so great. Take yourself down a peg. But this comparison is meant to be calming. It's meant to be motivating. It's meant to be, in some sense, uplifting. You have this capacity, like the worm does. The one thing that I heard you say, Payam, that I wondered about was this idea of moral choice. And I think you're absolutely right about it with respect to human beings. But I think that part of what the Baal Shem Tov is playing with here is the idea that the worm doesn't need to choose whether or not it's going to maximize its potential. It just does it. And this is where you're exactly right, Payam. You do need to choose. And that's a dilemma. There's a dilemma in here, right? Like the worm serves as a way to kind of, make us remember that we're all just kind of dirt and muck, in the end anyway. Or the worm is just one of God's creations, and so are you. So you're no. But there's a dilemma here, which is that the worm, you're supposed to be this great creature, but the worm is actually able to do its work without, knocking off and going to Vegas for the weekend, or the worm isn't like cheating its worm friends, and the worm isn't saying nasty things to the maggot. I mean, at least not that we know of. I mean, there's something implicit there that actually part of our dilemma is our choice, that we can actually be less than we are meant to be, whereas the worm's not going to be. Right? Okay. Hope Putman.
I have a couple of things to say. One is in the first text that you showed it. He's talking about it says we hope, the hope of humans is worms. So I think the key for me, the word is the hope. It's like, it's an aspiration. You hope, which kind of elevates the idea of worms, right? And then
that's really good, Hope. That's really interesting. And of course, Hope is
ironic because my name is Hope.
Give us this precise reading.
Yeah.
That's right. The hope of, or like the end, the final end usually translates to the final end, but actually there is something maybe aspirational. Maybe that all of this, maybe that's why all of these teachings you're meant to think, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing that I'll be heading back to the ground. It's a good thing that I'm just one of the creations. It's a good thing that I'm in the family of creatures, right? So that's beautiful. Thanks. And you were going to add another thought?
So you're kind of talking about everything has its thing, like worms have their purpose, bees, I'm no biologist. So let's talk about bees or ants. They have their purpose, right? But what is the purpose of humans as a species, right? And maybe we are just bugs that have gone bad. Like we think we're smarter and better and there's something special about us, but maybe we're just a mistake. I mean,
Yeah,
look what we've done to the world at this point. Look where we've brought with our humanness, what we've done to the earth. And if we were to expire, go extinct, the world would exist, but humans wouldn't. So I've been thinking about that. What is our purpose? Not like, so.
That's a good question. That is a good question. That is a good question in itself, but it's a question that I think you're right, naturally emerges from this dilemma that these texts are sort of like subtly teasing out. The dilemma that I just named, which is that it's not just that the worm is doing a great job, it's that we're not sure we're doing a great job. And so, Hope asks, the worm has a function. The worm's function is to feed on flesh and then create more worms, right? To decompose matter so that it's not sitting there rotting. Actually serves many functions. And when the worm knows what to do, or we even know what the worm is supposed to do. What are we supposed to do? What is the best use of our mind and power? Right? That's part of the question that we're asking here, okay? Okay, I'm gonna take 3 more comments and then we're gonna look at one last piece from the Maharal, from Ariella, and then Regina, and then Jen. Ariella?
What it made me think of is the biblical passage, to everything there is a season. And it's like everything has a purpose. And we shouldn't think that we're any better than anything else because we're just part of the plan.
Good. To see yourself as like, how does Mary Oliver put it? As a member of the family of things, right? Just like you're part of the scheme. It's important to see yourself as part of the scheme. So we've reflected on that, a couple of times now. What does it mean to see yourself as a worm in the system, a worm in the dirt? One of the ants in the ant colony, right? Like what does that do for us? And I'm asking that, as a serious, not just a rhetorical question. How does that feel? How does it feel to see you? Sorry, Ariella?
It humbles us.
It humbles us. Okay, good. All right, let's keep pressing forward. Regina.
I agree. It is very humbling. But I was also thinking, if we don't live up to our potential, are we breaking some kind of a cycle? We're creating some disruption in the world. And also, are we going to be worthy of, is the worms going to want to eat us at the end? Are we going to be worthy of them? So,
right.
Just thinking.
Right. Yeah, it's funny what you're saying. I never thought about it this way, but I'm building on Hope's comments that after all, the language is the hope of the human is the worm. There's something there that suggests, actually, maybe that's the best we could do, is if we're worm food, at least we're useful. There are ways to die that actually serve, like what if, through our wars, we blow each other up? That's not useful. We're not, maybe we ought to hope to be worm food, because at least then our rotting flesh serves the world once again. So that's a wild thought. Thank you for that. And Jen?
Yeah, I'm thinking about maybe humility a little differently as sort of the idea of limitation or finiteness, that, a story without an ending really isn't a story. It has no shape. If we lived forever, we probably would have way less motivation to be ethical with one another, because every mistake we made, we'd have time to undo. And no mistake we made would risk the life of anyone else if they lived forever. And similarly, a character with no limitations to overcome has no story. There's no movement, there's no narrative, there's no change if there's no limitation to overcome. So our awareness of our worm-likeness, our humility, our smallness in the face of God is what gives us the motivation and the space to grow and create a story that can be that change and that reflection that God wanted from the beginning in creating us.
Okay. All right. That's really helpful. That's really helpful. That actually, and part of what this is about is reminding us of our limitations, of our end. And that's been a central concern that the Torah has had from the very start, right? Why did God drive Adam and Eve out of the garden? Because they shouldn't become immortal. And it's like, once you have knowledge, then you have to be limited, because if you have no mortality, then you're God. And when we start to think of ourselves that way, then we lose all perspective. And actually, like, you cease to be productive. You cease to be fulfilling you cease to need to grow at all, because and the way that Jen puts it is so helpful. Imagine you had infinite time. What would you say most days? I'll do it tomorrow. It's fine. We're mortal, and we'll end up in the ground like everything else. Everything that is not God will die. You're not God. You're a lot closer to a worm than you are to God. And it's important in order to grow and to serve, and to this word serve, which, sometimes can strike us, pleasantly or unpleasantly, depending on how it's phrased. But this word to serve that we've seen the Baal Shem Tov refer to, or return to, you have a function. You have something to do. You have a purpose. You have some energy that you're putting out into the world, right? That's the creatures serve. God doesn't serve. God represents something else, something internal, something that doesn't need to be putting more energy into the world, right? Okay. All right. This is good. All right. I want to take us one last pass through this worm Torah. And I know I feel like this is a little bit of a messy class, but I mean, it's allowed to be messy, right? We're talking about maggots. But before I do, I want to turn to my stepfather one more time, because this Larry, this phrase here that the Baal Shem Tov uses at the end, you should imagine that you're a worm or one of the other little creatures. Think of them all as your friends in this world, all of whom were created and have only what the blessed creator gave them. This reminds me, Larry, of something that you once said. Do you remember this? I remember we were on it's a camping trip or a walk or something together. And I remember asking you, I don't remember exactly what we were talking about. How did you decide to go into your field or do the work you were doing in the world? I remember you saying something like, I had this big realization that I was just a little creature in the world, like all the other little. Do you remember that, Larry? This reminded me of that. So can you remind me of your version?
I don't really remember it myself. I'm sorry.
Oh, Lillian, nice to hear from you. You must have heard Lillian, but I actually said Larry.
Oh,
so there's no reason for you to remember. So nice to hear from you, Lillian.
Right.
All right, Larry, what do you think?
Well, yeah, I don't remember sure exactly what I said, but I've always, I lived in the woods in the past, and just walking through the woods, I always felt, well, I'm just a little animal here, and I always feel that I'm just another animal walking through the woods, and in that sense, one thing I was thinking here is, in the West, traditionally there's this idea of the great chain of being, where there's these lowly animals, the bacteria, the germs, the worms, dogs and apes, and then people, and then angels. And so there's all these different levels where the creatures are getting better and better and better. And now I think we've done away with that idea. And particularly with evolution, we're all equally evolved. Even the worms, we've all been around. We all living things started with one original cell, billions of years ago. And we've all evolved at equal times. So in some sense, we're all just as evolved as everything else. And so when I say, I felt like another animal, I felt like, I'm no better, I'm no higher level than anything else. I'm just one of the creatures on this earth.
And Larry, and one more question. And did that, as I remember it, is that part of what motivated you to then serve, as the Baal Shem Tov puts it, to do work for the other creatures on this earth? I mean, are those thoughts connected for you?
Oh, yes, definitely. I think, I'm one of the main things I'm interested in is ecology. And in ecology, it's important that we respect all living things, plants, animals, bacteria, whatever. They're all equally important. And we tend, as I said, in the West, we tend to put as the goal of everything is, humans. And humans are meant to rule over everything else. And I think that's led to a lot of ecological destruction in the West, particularly. And so I'm trying to work to sort of counter that idea where all things are valuable and we need to respect all things.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. And that's exactly right. I mean, here we are studying this worm Torah, right? And it seems a little weird. We kind of see how the rabbis are using it, and especially to encourage humility. But the implication that the Baal Shem Tov sees, the implication that I think my stepfather intuited is that, once I begin to see myself as equally created or equally evolved, and interestingly, in this conversation, I think that those terms sort of function in the same way. We all come from the same source, right? Then I have a sense of kinship to the world around me. And what greater, we've been talking about motivations to ethical behavior, what greater ethical mandate do we have before us than the need to fix what we have broken in the world around us, right? The ecosystem that we live in, that we have not served, that we have not made better for the other creatures, right? These other creatures that the Baal Shem Tov tells us are our friends, right? That Larry tells us are just other animals, just like us, right? So there's a real to come to see myself as a brother to the worm, right? That allows me then to see myself as a part of the family of things, right? The family of this world. Okay. I want to just, we are studying the Maharal here, and I just kind of got obsessed with worm Torah this week. So I hardly remembered to go. And then the last minute I went and I dug into the Maharal, and he did say one very interesting thing. And I don't even know if it's going to be a good ending to the class, because it's sort of a strange thing that he's saying, but I don't know if it'll be a perfect resolution, but I do need your help thinking through it. And it does pick up on some of the themes that we've been moving back and forth from here. That is the sense of our shared nature with all other things on the one hand, and then the other sense that we have, maybe mistakenly, but maybe grounded in some truth, that we are special, that human beings are distinct, that human beings, the Baal Shem Tov says our specialness is a problem. Like we won't end up fulfilling our whole potential, which the worm is doing. The Midrash said, if you are living right, then you are the pinnacle of creation, right? So, some of what we've been saying lately has been knocking that down. No, we're not the pinnacle. We're not special. We're not higher. But the very need to address that speaks to some tension that we feel, that on the one hand, we are these distinct, humans are, this is one of the things we celebrate, are made in the divine image, something unique about them. But on the other hand, something totally common. So which is it? And the Baal Shem Tov, the Maharal, who we've been looking at in the last couple of classes, the Maharal, as usual, gives us a kind of a scheme. He's always like mapping out systems and schemes, and in this case, he uses the word human, enosh, and then two other words for personhood or people, selfhood, and in doing so, he maps out a kind of a spectrum or a kind of a hybrid between the human as great, lofty, especially divine on the one hand, and the human as just dirt in the ground on the other. So let me show you what he does here, and maybe I think there's something in here that that is worth mining. So this whole class is a little experimental, so let's see what we do with this. But this is what the Maharal says. The Maharal says, now wait a minute. We read at the very outset that you should be very humble of spirit, for the hope of a human is worms. Okay, that's what we read. But don't human beings hope that their souls will be bound up under the throne of glory? Okay, that's a very lofty way to say, like, come on, really? I mean, aren't we special in some way? And this idea of being bound up under the throne of glory, that's another rabbinic tradition, that like the name of Israel was inscribed under the divine throne, and that's our aspiration. What is our hope? Our hope is not to be maggot food. Our hope is to be somehow with God. I mean, don't we have higher aspirations than just being part of the chain of being? I mean, we got to a place of feeling very tranquil and serene in our ecological family. But wait a minute. What about the special nature of the human being? Okay, so that's what the Maharal is going to be trying to answer here. Don't human beings hope that their souls will be bound up under the throne of glory? So why would he say the best a human can hope for is worms? Okay, and now he's going to give us 3 words, and he's going to use each of these words to describe a different part of who we are. And the words are Adam, Ish, or I'm going to add Isha, and then what's this first word that we used? Oh, I didn't transliterate it. Oh yeah, and enosh, human, enosh. Okay, the word that was used in our Mishnah is human, enosh. So he said the hope of a human is worms. Okay, but note he did not say the hope of a person, Adam, is worms. And that is because people are called Adam from the word Adama, earth. And from the side of us that is of earth, we are not food for the worms. For behold, the worms do not feed on the earth itself, rather they feed on rotting flesh. And the earth does not rot. I'm gonna have to check my science with Larry on this one, but that's what he says. That the dirt, what worms feed on is things that rot. So dirt doesn't rot. The worms the maggots aren't eating dirt. And he did not say the hope of a man, ish, and the feminine of that would be isha, or woman, and I hasten to add that and everything in between in this era of rethinking all of our gender categories. But the point is, he's got another word for a person, ish or isha, and that word ish refers to the inner force, the koach, the power within us. And the part of man that is pure force is not bound for the worms. You will find that the word ish comes about this, or is about this. I think probably is about this in every place. Oh my gosh, it's getting kind of chaotic. Is about this in every place. Is about this in every place. In other words, the word ish represents power. like a man of war, or are you not a man? So that aspect of a person, the force within them, also does not go to the worms. All right, I know this is complicated, but essentially he's saying we have a spiritual part. That's not what the worms feed on. And we have a dirt part of us, and that doesn't rot either. Again, I'm not sure the science here, but just bear with me for one more paragraph, and then I think you'll see where he's headed. Rather, a person becomes food for worms because of both of them together, in that there's in human beings this particular quality that their force is embedded in the physical, and that it is both of them together that makes for worm food. For this is what causes deterioration in humans, that their force, in other words, their spiritual potential, is embedded in the physical. And when we call a person human, we're referring to this quality of force embedded in physicality. So behold that there are three words for a person. There's Adam, person. There's Ish, Isha, which is man or woman. And then there is human, Enosh. The word Ish refers to the force itself. The word Adam refers to the earthly part. And the word Enosh refers to both of them, the divine force and the earthly body joined together, the force embedded in the physical. Okay, even as I read that, I'm confusing myself. Like, is this really the text I wanted to end on? I'm sorry. But first of all, I just had to give a little maharal. But also, I do think that this is the last question. So I want to just speak out what I think he's trying to say that I don't fully understand. And I just wonder if anyone, given all of the thinking we've done about what exactly are we? Are we animals? Or are we something greater, something divine? I think what he's saying is there's a part of us that is just matter, stuff. And then there's a part of us that is just energy. And that part of us is what we think of as the divine part of us. And the matter is what we think of it as the natural part of us. Okay, fair enough. But there's no problem with either of those things. There's no dilemma with either of those things. It's the combination that is so complicated. It's the fact that we have this kind of divine energy, this divine force, this divine quality, this kind of spiritual nature, but it's in maggot food. It's embedded in just stuff, dirt, muck. And that's part of that combination. That's part of what is so troubling for us, because we are this beautiful thing, which nevertheless rots. And there's something about that just we can't quite settle ourselves on. So that's the Maharal's take on this, and it's complex. But I wonder if anyone has any thoughts on that. I saw Jen raise. I saw Hope. Do you have your hand up again? No. Okay. So let's end with. I think we're almost out of time, but let's end with Jen, who kind of took us to this place anyway of dealing with the dilemma of our personhood within limits. Jen, what do you think?
Well, I just really go back to what Florine said early on about worms as a symbol of transformation and resurrection, because if we are that spiritual part embedded in a physical part, you can see symbolically that the worms are eating away the physical part and releasing the spiritual part. They're serving a purpose in allowing us to really take that spiritual part and bring it into fruition through our mortality.
Yeah, I love that. Any last thoughts before we close? Anyone want to build on that? Yeah, I think that there's some. Thanks for returning us to Florine's formulation at the outset, and we've been returning to consider that again and again. The way that if we're worm food, then we're energy for the next form of life, and we know that we have our consciousness is our great dilemma. Right? We know that we have something special inside of us. We know that we have a spirit. We know that we have energy. We are able to be aware of the wonder that is ourselves. The worm is also wondrous, but maybe the worm isn't sitting there thinking about it. The worm's just doing its wonder, right? Where we are we're troubled because we look inside ourselves and we see such depth, such beauty, such wonder, such divine potential. But then we get scared because we think, well, what's going to happen? Is this is this all going to be lost? Am I just going to rot into the ground? And as Jen encourages us, the part of the solution to that dilemma is to embrace our mortality, is to know that we are meant to pass into another form, because that thing which is so beautiful about us, that thing that is so divine about us, that's energy. And that just keeps going. So let go of your bodies. Let go of yourselves. Let it be food to the next creature, because your spirit, your koach, your energy, your force, it persists. Okay, I think we're just at time, but I want to take Florine, having returned to Florine's opening comments, let me just give her the last words.
Oh my gosh. Well, I think that the energy is the key. We know the inner part will become rot, may be transformed. We know the Adam, not just Adama, but Adam meaning God and blood of God, life of God. In between is the energy, and that's our challenge. Where are we going to use our energy? And will it take on a form to the left, or will it take on a form to the right? That's a challenge.
Yeah.
This was great.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Thank you for indulging me. It's like a little bit of a mess. I just sort of got excited by the image and wanted to play it. I don't know, because I didn't really know where we were going. But we ended up in all kinds of beautiful places. And we did what I think our sages wanted us to do, which is to reflect on our own humanity and to wonder what it is exactly, and how it makes us distinct, and maybe more to the point, how it makes us the same as all the other little creatures, our friends that make up this wide and wonderful world. So thanks, everybody, and I will see you next week. We counted the 30th night of the Omer last night, so if you're on the count, keep going, and wishing you a beautiful rest of your week. Thanks to Larry for the inspiration. I appreciate it.